Finally, for the first time in the history of this channel, we are trying something by the legendary brand Fryette on the channel. And of course, I'm talking about the PS-100 Powerstation. A very powerful device that I have slept on, I'm afraid. But now it's here and it's awesome. And I think that this is going to be a really cool and valuable addition to the studio. And today we're going to explore why that is. And not only do I think that this is a very valuable tool for my studio, I think this could be an essential tool for anybody who likes to play through tube amps, basically. Anyway, let's dive in right away with a demo song to see how you can use this thing, okay? Check it out. All right, that was awesome. So that was my Balaguer Espada Limited 2024 through the Lichtlarm Audio, the King in Yellow boost pedal into the Tube Workshop Lulis, which is kind of like a modded Marshall, really cool amplifier. Did a full review on that on the channel. The guy who built that amplifier, Mario, he's a really nice guy, and he also helped with getting this thing on the channel. So thanks to Mario. That amplifier was fed into the Powerstation, which I used not only as an attenuator, because I fed the signal from the Powerstation into my Grossmann Fatbox 1x12, loaded up with an Eminence Texas heat speaker, mic'd up with two SM57s and one MD421 and sent into the DAW. But I also used it as a reactive load, which you heard. So I took the direct out into my computer and applied one of my own IRs onto it from the Heise pack, which is based on a Heise Demon, just so you guys could hear the difference. Anyway, that sounded really good. I basically had this thing set so that it sounded super flat. And what I basically used it as I said, is as an attenuator. So I wanted to crank the level of that amplifier to find a nice sweet spot and then bring the level back down again with the Powerstation. Because in this studio, in this room, I don't need loud levels. I do use an ISO cabinet, but still, I prefer to keep the level coming out of my speaker moderate. And this thing is ideal for that, basically. So what is the Fryette Powerstation exactly? Well, on the one hand, it is a reactive load, okay? So what it does is it takes the signal from the speaker out of your amplifier and soaks it up into the load, which means that you can connect it to your computer or some other device, an IR loader or whatnot, and use your amps with zero volume. So you don't need to connect a speaker to your amplifier or to the Powerstation per se. So that is cool. You can use it just as any other load box, basically. But be aware that this thing has no built-in IR loader. You're gonna have to do that in your DAW or your modeler or whatever. And it's important to note that you can use this thing as a reactive load passively, so without any power hooked up to the Powerstation. Now, according to the manual, with the power on, the fans will work, and with the power off, the fans won't work. So you won't be able to use 200-watt amplifiers with the Powerstation when you're using it as a passive load. So keep that in mind. But aside from it being a reactive load, it's also a 100 watt tube power amp. Now it's a tube power amp, sure, but it's a very clean sounding power amp. So it's not really made to color the sound of your amplifier per se. And this is basically a more advanced and clean sounding attenuator. So you can put your amplifier in here, crank it up real loud as you want it basically, and then bring the level down with the built-in tube amplifier, which basically re-amplifies the signal coming out of the reactive load section. Still following me? Okay. Now you can also use this not as an attenuator, but as a make it more louderer. So you can put really low wattage amplifiers into here, say like a 15 watt little tube amp, and make it louder and give it more headroom. Because with those low wattage amplifiers, people complain often that, they get too squishy when you push them too hard, when the power tubes start to saturate. Well, with this thing, you can find a position on the master volume control that still sounds good with plenty of headroom, and then basically boost the headroom with the 100 watts. Another cool feature is the effects loop, which is really handy for amplifiers that don't have an effects loop. Like a lot of classic amps and stuff don't have effects loops, and sometimes you want really clean reverb and delay effects after your amplifier. And if your amp doesn't have an effects loop, you're screwed unless you have a power station, so you can put effects after the amplifier with that. There's also a return level switch, and you can turn the effects loop on or off with a foot switch, so that is cool. The PS-100 has 2 channels that are also switchable. So we have channel 1 over here and channel 2. That means you can use that as a solo boost, for example, or just to have different flavors that you can dial in with the tone controls. Talking about the tone controls, we have some controls over here that you can use to fine-tune the sound of your amp going into the speaker. So we have presence and depth controls. Presence adds top end and depth adds low end thump. They're not super drastic, but they are musical sounding, and they'll come in very handy with dialing in the sound of your amplifier with the power station. We have volume controls over here as well, with very smooth tapers, so you can use very low levels up to very loud levels. It's not like some amplifiers where as soon as you move this control up a little bit, it gets very loud. No, it's very smooth and very usable, so with great range, which is wonderful. We have a select switch over here to select between the 2 channels manually. We also have a level switch over here, just to fine-tune the input level of the amplifiers. For very loud amplifiers, you can basically attenuate the level a little bit with this switch over here. And then we have these switches over here to fine-tune the top and bottom end. They are quite drastic, as you'll hear in a minute. The bottom switch is for the bottom end, obviously. Flat is flat. Warm adds a very nice and deep thump to the signal, and deep as well, but with a little bit of a different flavor. And then for the top end, we have bright and edge, both also giving you different options. And I think that these switches will come in handy, especially when you're using this as a reactive load, to simulate that impedance interaction, if you know what I mean. A lot of reactive loads don't really give you control over this, but I like the fact that with the power station, you do have control over the bottom end and the top end, so you can really fine-tune the response and tone of your tube amplifier. Now the power station also has a line in, so you can also amplify other devices with this. I haven't tried that myself, but I can imagine that it will come in very handy for amplifying preamps and modelers and stuff like that. So that is really cool. Of course, we have a balanced line out with a ground lift switch and a little line out potentiometer on the back as well, which also comes in very handy. And the line out can be used to send the signal to the mixing desk or to your DAW or to your modeler or IR loader and whatnot. Of course, we have a speaker out with impedance selection as well as an amp in, again with impedance selection, so 4, 8 or 16 ohms. Now with the power on for the amp in, you can use amps with power ratings up to 200 watts, which is a lot, but you're going to have to be very careful with that if you want to crank those amplifiers up all the way. I think that's dangerous. And again, when you use this as a passive load, that's basically 100 watts instead of 200 watts. Now with this switch over here, the bypass switch, which says bypass or operate, you can turn the unit on or off when the signal is going to the speaker. So that's good for comparing the sound of the power station on and off. So you can use that to fine tune the sound and make it sound as neutral as possible. Now I did notice that the settings will vary from amp to amp if you want this thing to sound very neutral, right? So with the Tube Workshop Lulis, when I set depth and presence all the way to 0, and when I had the switches to flat, it sounded very neutral. But with the amp that I'm going to try in a minute, different settings applied, right? So for the MT15, which I'll use in a minute, I had to set presence at around 3 or 4 o'clock or so, if I remember correctly, and depth to around 2 o'clock to get the same results. I was expecting that to be different for some reason, probably because I'm not a technical expert. So that's not ideal, but you know, it's probably just how that technology works, right? So to get this thing to sound as neutral as possible, so to basically get it to sound as if the power station isn't connected at all, you're gonna have to dial in these controls depending on the amplifier, okay? So just use your ears and dial in these controls. Okay, I think I covered just about everything. What I'd like to do now is grab a guitar, plug in my PRS MT15, and do some dialing in and tweaking so you guys can sort of hear how it sounds and how all the controls react and all that good stuff. Let's do that right now. Check it out. All right, guys, so I'm holding my Schecter Solo 2 Custom tuned to Drop D. I'm playing through my PRS MT15 on the lead channel for a nice high gain tone. The amp is being fed into the power station, and then the signal from the power station is going into my Grossmann Fatbox 1x12 cabinet loaded up with the Celestion Vintage 30. And right now I have the MT15 set to a nice and low level because I don't want to push the signal too loud into my cabinet. And the power station is currently set to bypass. So let's see how the amplifier sounds with the signal going through the power station, but with the power station set to bypass. So it's not coloring the sound right now. It's just letting the signal from the amplifier through into my cabinet. Let's take a listen. Cool. Now I have the power station set up so that it doesn't really color the sound. So let's do an A/B of the amplifier with the power station on and the power station in bypass. I don't have the settings flat, I do have the switches off. So the bright and warm switches are set to flat, but the presence and depth controls I had to dial in to get it to sound the same basically. So let's do an A/B, starting with the power station set to bypass. So as you can hear, with these settings, it doesn't really color the sound that much. I'm sure I could fine tune it even further, but it's close enough for me. Now, as I mentioned, the level of this amplifier is set quite low, and I want to be able to crank this amplifier a little bit more without changing the volume. So what I'm going to do now is lower the volume on the power station and then raise the volume on the MT15 to compensate so that we get a little bit more power amp coloration out of this amplifier. Let's do that right now. Don't want it to be too loud. So right now the power station is basically acting as an attenuator as it's bringing the level of the MT15 down. So now that we're doing that, let's play around with the controls a little bit so you guys can hear how they affect the tone, starting with the presence control. That's all the way to 0. This is noon. Three o'clock. And you'll notice that the last quarter basically does the most. Take a listen. So there's more than enough presence on tap if you want to brighten up an amp that's a little bit darker, or if you're running an amplifier really hot, where the power tubes start to saturate and darken the tone, then you can use this to compensate and to open the amp up a little bit, which is nice. So I have it set to around, let's say 230. Now let's do the same thing with the depth control. That's all the way off. And that's with the control fully up. It's a little bit too much. Let's turn it down again to around 2 o'clock or so. So that's really cool for if you have an amplifier that, for example, doesn't have a presence or depth control. Then you can use this to fine-tune the top and bottom end to taste, which is really nice. Now, of course, the Powerstation also has a couple of other cool features, like the select control, which you can use to select either one of the two channels with different settings. So for example, say we want a setting that's a little bit more mild, then we can switch over to the green channel or the bottom channel, and it will sound a little bit differently, and you can have a different volume level there as well. So right now, you know, presence and depth are set to noon, and the volume setting is set a little bit lower, so around 9 o'clock or so. See what happens when we switch between the two. So that is super handy for if you want to, for example, have different settings for a solo boost or something like that. Really nice. Over here we also have these two switches. The bottom switch controls the bottom end, and the top switch controls the top end. Now let me lower the presence and depth controls here to, let's say, 9 o'clock, and then I'll let you guys hear how much of an effect these controls have. We're going to start with warm. Right now it's set to flat, and I'm going to move it up to the warm position. So that gives it quite a bit more low-end thump, which can come in very handy with certain amplifiers or certain speakers, of course. That's really nice. Now let's also try the deep setting. So let's set depth all the way off. Back to warm. And back to flat. So flat with the depth control to 0 is a little bit too thin for my taste. So let's raise it up again to, let's say, 2 o'clock or so. Let's do the same with the bright switch. And I'm going to turn down the presence all the way so you guys can hear how this sounds. Starting with flat. Going to the bright setting. And then to the edge setting. So that can be useful, you know, for speakers that are a little bit on the dark side, like the Eminence DV77, for example. That's a kind of dark speaker with a rolled off top end. So it's really cool to have these voicing options. Now let's use the bright setting along with the warm setting and see how that sounds. Let me turn down the depth. And let me turn down depth all the way, see how that sounds. Let's try the same thing, but with deep for the bottom end switch. So there's quite a lot of control. Now let's set them back to flat and then raise the presence and depth controls again See how that sounds. It's just a different type of feel and sound, basically. So the presence and depth controls definitely are more on the subtle side, whereas the other switches, so the top end and the low end or bottom end switches, are more on the drastic side. And of course, I'm also running the signal from the Powerstation into my DAW, pure with the reactive load signal going straight into the DAW. And let's see how that sounds with an IR. So purely functioning as a reactive load, this thing also does a great job. All right, that was interesting. So the Fryette Powerstation PS-100 dual mode reactance amplifier. What a cool piece of gear that I think will come in very handy in the studio. And why do I want one? Well, I want to have more control over the levels of my amplifiers independently of how high or low I set the master volume. So for some amplifiers, I just want to be able to crank them up without having them be super loud through my 1x12 ISO cab. I like to keep things at moderate levels, even though the ISO cab mutes the level about 30 decibels, which is great, but still I want more control over the levels, right? So this is going to be great for that, to use it as an attenuator. And also, some of the speakers that I own are like 25 watt speakers, like a greenback, and I want to make sure that if I crank an amplifier really loudly, I can turn it down here so that I don't damage those speakers. I also think it will come in very handy as a reactive load, but it's also going to be great as a tone shaping tool. Sometimes when you're working with certain amplifiers, I'm like, could use a little bit more bottom end, or could use a little bit more top end. Well, in those cases, I can use the presence and depth controls or these switches over here to fine tune the tone. So it's also a very powerful tone shaping tool. Not to mention the fact that I can use this as a power amp for modelers and stuff, but I haven't tried that yet. I might try that soon on the channel as well. That could be very interesting. So my overall thoughts are really positive. I think it's really good. It sounds really good. It did take a little while before I got used to how this thing works and how to dial in the controls. I was expecting it to sound neutral for every single amplifier with the same settings, which turned out to be not the case. That is fine. It has a little bit more of a learning curve than I was expecting, but it does sound very good. And it does sound very clean as well. So for my studio, this is a very powerful tool indeed, and I love it. And I really recommend checking this thing out if you're looking for a device like this. Thanks a lot to Jürgen for helping me out with this, and also Mario, as I mentioned. Really appreciate you guys. And let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Have you ever tried the Fryette Powerstation? Let me know. And also let me know how you like to use the unit and what your general observations are. Also, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, as that really helps the channel out. I'd really appreciate it. If you want to support the channel, get something at my affiliate links for Thomann and Sweetwater or Tube Amp Doctor. Maybe get yourself something from Fryette, for example. That would really help out the channel at no additional cost for you. Or you can buy some IR packs at my web store as well. I'll put links below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Cheers!